All right, y'all. Welcome to your first lecture for Modern World History. If you missed class yesterday or if you want a refresher from what we reviewed, this is the entire lecture. And if you're just trying to get the last bits of what you missed from class, fast forward until you get to the appropriate slide. So let's begin. Just kidding. There we go. All right, so before we begin, if you have not had a chance to set up your notebooks, and this is something that you can either do by hand or you can type, remember that there will be times that I will be checking your notes and you will be receiving credit for completing your notes. So we're going to set up our page by splitting it in kind of 1/3 to 2/3. The majority of our writing, etc., is going to be on the right 2/3. We're using this nice indentation of our standard outline style that you hopefully remember from last year. This is so information stands out, so it's more easy to find because we want to make our lives as easy as possible. We want to do as little work as possible. So the more we set things up clearly and easily in our notes, the easier our life will be. Now, on the left side, these are going to be for keywords, questions, extra information, images, whatever helps you process this information. And then we always end with a summary, usually a few phrases or sentences that just kind of wrap things up. So if we only have 30 seconds to review our work, we're going to look at the summary. That's going to be the highlights. All right, so once you've set up your notebook, click next slide. So we are starting modern world history in about 1750, and that's really when historians believe that the modern era truly begins. And the reason for this is because we see a lot of major political shifts around the globe. So starting with Europe, this is the end of the Ancien Regime, which is just a fancy French way of saying ancient regime. Because prior to 1750, governments and political states were set up in such a way that kind of referred back to going all the way back to the Middle Ages that you might remember from like 7th grade history. And after 1750, we start to see some major political, social, economic changes. So the major countries of Europe at this time are going to be England, France, and Spain. And this is because they are some of the first to expand their empires into other continents like Africa and the Americas. And they also have some of the longest standing governments, the most consistent rule, the most consistent lands. Like England has been the England that we know of it, essentially since 1066 with Battle of Hastings. France has been that main area of France. Same thing with Spain since the 600s and 800s. So, they've been going around for millennia at this point. Really consistent, super powerful. In addition, these countries, as well as other European powers, have absolute monarchies. Now, remember, a monarchy is a system of government that is ruled by a king or queen. It's a dynastic rule, so their children then become the next ruler. So right now, England is still a monarchy. Queen Elizabeth II is the current queen. When she passes, her son, Charles, will become the next king, so monarchy. But these are special kinds of monarchies. These are absolute monarchies. And that means they have absolute power. The head of state has total control, that what they say goes. Now, why do people believe in this? Why are people like, sure, King Charles, sure, King Philip, etc., you should have total control? The reason because of this is because this is a deeply religious society. They're very Christian, very Catholic, and they believe in this concept of divine right, that God has chosen this monarch. And of course, we don't go against God because God is the ultimate power. So that's one of the reasons why people buy into this system of government that puts them all here at the bottom primarily, with the king and queen at the top. And I guess if we really want to extend this, we would have above this, a little god there, because that's the ultimate power. Here's a nice cartoon from that era. So we can see kind of the upper class, king and queen, monarchy area. And who are they on top of? Once again, those peasants, those serfs. So that's really what governments are like at the start of the 18th century. And they had been this way for several centuries, going back millennia in some examples. Whoops. All right. However, people start questioning this. And that's because in the 17th centuries, you might remember from 7th grade history, there's a thing called the scientific revolution. When people discovered things, this is when Galileo was like, hey, I think the Earth revolves around the sun and not the opposite way, and I can prove it because science and maths. And people are like, that's crazy. And in fact, the Catholic Church, excommunicates him. It's a whole big thing. But people are like, oh my gosh, if you use science, if you use reason, you can figure things out. Because prior to this, people just based things off of religion and faith. When there were floods and thunderstorms and earthquakes, people thought that was God punishing the world. Now, when there's floods and earthquakes, etc., we can use reason and deduction to figure things out. So, for example, right now we're experiencing all these terrible fires in Northern California. And if this were, the 1700s, we might believe that that's God, like punishing us for, I don't know, the 49ers or doing whatever. But instead now we know it's based off of climate change and a changing, world, etc. So people are using reason and science to make decisions, not just thinking based off of religious ideas. So that's really kind of one of the basis of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is this period, think about it, enlighten, turning on that light bulb. People are really starting to shed light on kind of new beliefs, etc. One of these new beliefs is this idea of natural rights, which maybe you remember from some of the 8th grade history. But natural rights, that's going to be your life, liberty, and property. If that sounds familiar to you, it's one of the bases that this country was founded upon, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Why didn't we have property, Thomas Jefferson? Because Thomas Jefferson was owning people as property, and it would be pretty hypocritical to say everyone deserves property when you're literally owning other people. That's a whole story for another time. This stuff clearly has some feelings about that. So the Enlightenment, these philosophers even, also known as philosophes, just a fancy way of saying philosopher, they believed in natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and that governments are in a social contract with their citizens. Now think about a contract. When you sign a contract, like we've signed, for your classes, etc., it's an agreement between two parties. That party A will do X and party B will do Y. And if one party fulfills or fails to fulfill their part of the deal, then the other party has the right to say this contract is over. So this sense of a social contract that really comes from these two gentlemen right here, Mr. John Locke, Mr. Thomas Hobbes. They believed that citizens are in a contract with governments, and if the government fails, if the government makes a bad decision, if that monarch does something wrong, then citizens have the right to rebel. And this actually plays out in England in the 17th century with King Charles I and II, in which both Charleses made some really bad decisions. And the English citizens were like, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes says we have the right to rebel. And they actually did, and turns England into a civil war. It was terrible. At least one of the Charleses gets executed. The first gets executed. It's a whole big thing. But that's this concept of the social contract. And these two fundamental beliefs, natural rights and social contract, are going to directly influence many, many actions, many, many revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th century. Some other philosophers of the Enlightenment period are going to be Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire, as well as many, many others. All right, so that was a little bit about what's going on in Europe. We have these absolute monarchs, and we start to have these new belief systems of social contract and natural rights. In other parts of the world, it's important to know what's going on with these governments. So in Asia, we have these dynastic rulers, so similar to Europe, in which they're monarchies and the families continue. But these are really known as gunpowder empires. And the reason why they're known as gunpowder empires is because these are diverse populations of large swaths of land that are controlled through strong military. Gun and artillery and lots of weapons are being developed in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And these large military-based leaders utilize them to create these empires with total near control. I'm going to flip forward just so we can see the slide real fast. So some of the areas we're talking about, and we're talking about all of Asia here, which is pretty big. So we're looking at the Ottoman Empire that spreads throughout what we know now as the Middle East. At their height, they're actually all the way up in Eastern Europe, as well as across Northern Africa. We're looking at the Russian Empire under the Romanovs that starts in the 17th century. We're looking at the Mughal Empire of India that takes almost the entire subcontinent of India. We're looking at the start of the Qing dynasty in China. And we're even looking at Japan under the Edo period here. So when we're talking about these dynastic rulers in Asia, we're really looking at almost the entire continent of Asia are controlled by these large, large empires that use control through their weaponry to really maintain their control. All right, so the Ottoman Empire, this is ruled by sultans. That's just the fancy word for their head of state, like emperor or king. They start in the 14th century. They start actually closer to India and then kind of move westward. But really their height is about the 1500s, 16th century. And by 1750, they're starting to decline. They're starting to lose their land. It's a very diverse population. And the interesting thing about the Ottomans is that they allow people to maintain their individual identities. That's going to come back to bite them later, that they don't force these diverse populations to then start speaking their language and practice their customs. They let people maintain their own cultural identities. And spoiler alert, we're going to hear more about that in a couple months and see how that plays out. In Tsarist Russia, and sometimes you'll see Tsar spelled Tsar, sometimes you'll see it Czar. That's because the Cyrillic alphabet does not have a direct correlation to the Latin-based alphabet that we use. But from the 17th century, the Romanov family is going to rule. These are going to be your Peter the Greats, your Catherine the Greats, your Ivan the Terribles, going all the way up to Nicholas II, who's the last Romanov ruler, who, spoiler alert, does not end his life on a positive note in 1919. So again, here's the map. So we were just talking about the Ottomans. This is them at the height. By 1750, they've lost a lot of this chunk and they've lost all of that, and they're really concentrated here. And then the Russian Empire under the Romanovs is spanning all the way from the west here in St. Petersburg, all the way to the east. And I don't know those cities, but they're there. Looking at some of our other dynastic rulers of these gunpowder empires, we have the Mughal Empire that's controlling almost all of India. It's a Muslim empire that begins in the 16th century, so the 1500s. And they get their power through gunpowder, through using some strong armies and strong technology, but also through controlling trade. They control these major routes. And if you remember learning about the spice road, that was one of the main ways that people were able to deliver spices and goods and materials, things that Europe did not have access to. It really goes through Asia. And the Mughals here are able to control that main road. And when you control trade, that gives you a lot of power. So the Mughals are really controlling that region there. Just east of them, we have the Manchu Qing dynasty that begins in the 17th century and the 1600s. The Manchus are able to kind of take over from the previous Han dynasty, and they expand across East Asia and basically control all of what we kind of consider to be modern China. They're super influenced by Confucian and traditional values. So under the previous dynasty, things got a little spicy, things got a little exciting, and the Manchus come in and they're like, no, we're going back to business. So they're very austere and autocratic in their rule. And just like the Mughals to the west, they also control trade throughout that entire region, which gives them a lot of power, and is one of the reasons why this dynasty lasts for several centuries. And then just across the sea, right into Japan, unifies during this period. So the three islands kind of become consolidated under the Edo rule, but they remain mostly isolated from Western powers. They really become insular. There's a little bit, they allowed some trade from the Dutch and from the Portuguese, just a smidge, but primarily they are closing in unto themselves and will remain that way for several centuries. All right, just so we can put some faces to some names, here's some fancy people that are ruling at that time. So your Elizabeths, your Philips, your Catherine the Greats, your Shahs, your Shinkangs, your Suleimans, et cetera, et cetera. So fancy. Look at how fun they're all dressing. Don't you wish we dressed like this now? No, maybe not. Oh well, always try it again. All right, so that's really looking at what's happening in Europe and Asia. At the same time, we're starting to see some shifts in power looking at the Americas. And by 1750, by the mid 18th century, majority of Central and South America, so that's going to be our Central America, what's now modern day kind of Mexico, going all the way down to Panama, as well as South America. This region is mostly entirely controlled by Spain, which we can see in the red. Look at Spain. They have, at this point, a good chunk of what's now the United States of America, Mexico, all Central America, and then the entire western half of South America. And Brazil gets the other big chunk here, what's now modern day Brazil. I'm sorry, I said Brazil. Portugal gets what's now modern day Brazil, which is why in South America, all these countries speak Spanish as their national main language. And in Brazil, they speak Portuguese. Fun fact. The reason why this happens, the Treaty of Tordesillas, which maybe you remember from a long time ago, which basically Spain and Portugal, I'm doing great today, we're going to come to blows and have major fights over who got to control what part of what's now South America. And they then sign a treaty, which basically cuts it in half, uses this longitude line here, and says, all right, Portugal gets everything east and Spain gets everything west. Fun fact. So that's Central and South America. Pretty much what we need to know is Spain and Portugal are dominating the region. There's a little bit of France, a little bit of the Netherlands, a little bit of England, but we don't talk about them. England is going to control a good chunk of North America, and that's going to be United States of America, what becomes USA, as well as Canada. So they're controlling, still a big chunk of Canada, as well as kind of this eastern region. We all know that they have about 26 years left, and then that's all going to go by the wayside, although Canada will remain under British control for many more decades. And then there's a little bit of Spain hanging out there. There's a little bit of Russia, because Russia actually goes to right about here. So Alaska is actually way closer to Russia than we think. That's why Sarah Palin did her whole thing, but that's a story for another day. What are these colonies doing? They are not created so Spain and Portugal and England, etc., can be like, hey, we want to share wonderful things from our country. No, these colonies exist to provide raw material and labor for the colonizing powers. That means that they are not concerned about improving the quality of life of the indigenous people. Indigenous is a fancy word for native to the land. So when we talk about Native Americans throughout the Americas, they're indigenous peoples. So instead, the indigenous peoples work on many experiences slave plantations, and they work to create cash crops. Cash crops are basically crops that are grown and then immediately exported for the owners to then sell. So they're not things that are grown and then the people who tend the fields, etc., then use those items. Instead, they are sold off. And this means that only the owners gain wealth and power. For some plantations, for some areas, workers are not working as slave labor. They do get paid, but they get paid a very small amount. They're kept very poor. And then we know that there's a lot of slave plantations, obviously, in our country. We have a long history of slavery. But throughout this region, throughout Central America, as well as South America, there's a lot of slavery that occurs there as well. And again, this means that the indigenous peoples are remaining very poor, and these minority groups of owners, they're gaining the wealth. And really, who's really gaining the wealth are going to be these people and these countries, which is why they're so powerful and our main countries we talk about when we talk about Europe at this time. Also important to note that at this time, Christianity is being spread. Now, the indigenous peoples, they have their own religions, their own identities. But at this time, we have Catholic missionaries that are going into the region and spreading Catholicism. That's why in California, we have all those missions. They're built by the Catholic missionaries to, spread religion. And, that was their one attempt to kind of improve the quality of life. But that's also super problematic, because that's indicating that the quality of life and the religious beliefs and the religious identities of these indigenous people are not already good and just and equal unto themselves. So again, kind of reinforcing these stereotypes, reinforcing these beliefs that Europe is the ideal culture and that they're trying to bring up other cultures to match Europe and not seeing them as equal unto themselves. So again, thinking back to ethnic studies, this is starting to reinforce why we start to see this dominant narrative of European powers and European culture and experiences. We see it playing out in the colonization of the Americas. The other thing to note about colonization of the Americas is we can't talk about that without talking about trade going across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe, Africa, and the Americas. So hopefully this is a little bit of a reminder of what we've learned in the past. But big takeaways from this is that trade across the Atlantic is benefiting solely Europe. Europe is controlling the trade, and Europe is benefiting from the trade. And this is at the expense of Africa and the Americas. There's two explicit types of trade that occurs. The first is the Columbian Exchange, named after Christopher Columbus, who we know is so problematic, as we've all learned about. The Columbian Exchange is the first, and that's really between Europe, what we call the Old World, and the Americas, the New World, problematic terms. But this spreads a lot of new plants, animals, and diseases across the ocean. Because this is really the first time that people, plants, animals from Europe are brought to the Americas and vice versa. And actually a lot of items that we kind of always assume is like, have been in these regions forever, like corn in the Americas, and potatoes and tomatoes, etc. in Europe, they actually had not been in those regions until this Columbian Exchange. And a little more image here. So just some main ideas. So sugarcane, bananas, citrus fruits, all the things that we really associate with the economies and food cultures of the Americas, that had not been, those are not indigenous, not native to the land, but really it's from the Columbian Exchange. And then same thing with a lot of, these items here for the first time, they're brought to Europe in the 1500s. When we think about Ireland and like what's the main food we associate with Ireland, potatoes, they're not native to Ireland at all. And same thing, some of these things. The other thing to note is disease. This is really going to have a major impact on the region here because the people here had never been exposed to disease. And as we're living through right now, when you're not exposed to diseases, when they're brand new, it can create a pandemic or an epidemic. And if you do not have the antibodies to fight off that disease, it leads to a lot of death and devastation, which is unfortunately, I've promised to make our history class as relevant to our modern world as possible. Unfortunately, that's a really, really relevant thought process, which is really sad and terrible. Fun fact about tomatoes, Europeans were very scared of tomatoes and they thought they were the devil's fruit and people were very frightened to eat them. And it was Ben Franklin who had to be like, y'all, like, it's cool. You can eat a tomato. It won't die. The devil's not going to get inside you. But people were really suspicious of tomatoes. So next time you have a tomato, think about, is it the devil's fruit? I don't know. All right. The other type of trade that happens, and this is really starting in the 1600s and really blowing up in the 1700s, is the triangle trade, named for the triangular motion of these ships. So what happens is enslaved Africans are brought to the Americas against their will, totally wrong, totally stolen. Slavery is terrible and it is horrible, and that's not something we should ever forget. In exchange, so enslaved Africans are brought to the Americas, they're dropped off, sold into slavery, it's terrible. And then the ships are filled with goods from the Americas, like sugar and tobacco, and a lot of those other things we just saw in the Columbian Exchange. They're brought to Europe, and then that's dropped off. And then in Europe, that's where we see manufacturing. So things are being built. That's brought from Europe to Africa to kind of pay off for those slaves that are captured in Africa. During the triangle trade in the century of the 18th century, approximately 12.5 million slaves are brought to the Western Hemisphere at this time. So it has major impacts on the continent of Africa, as well as really, truly influences the creation of the nations in the Americas. 12.5 million, and that's not speaking of the millions who lost their lives on the passage. If we remember learning about the Middle Passage, which is one of the most brutal periods in human history. Really super horrible. All right, and again, climate change. Here's a nice cartoon that really, I think, speaks to who's benefiting. So we have the mother country. This kind of play looks very English here. And what are the colonies bringing to the mother country here? Silver, gold, foodstuffs, or raw materials. So they're kind of like seen as like, the maids here, bringing the food. And notice that the mother country, what is she giving back to these people? Nothing. But she's looking pretty good here, and these ladies are very clearly, not doing as well financially. So a nice visual representation of the trade across the Atlantic. All right, so kind of starting to wrap things up, what are the effects of this trade, these trades in the region? So the first thing is starting in the 16th century, we have this experience called the Great Dying. Due to smallpox and other disease germs, they kill the indigenous population. I abbreviate population to PUP because sometimes I don't like to write everything out. And because Native Americans had no exposure, they never experienced smallpox and other diseases, they had no immunity. And that takes, some generations to really build up immunity to diseases. And in fact, smallpox you need a vaccine for. So you never really build up immunity. And that leads to the killing of just immense amounts of population. In fact, in about 1500, the population of the Americas from North, Central, and South America was about 22 million. In a century and a half later, the population goes down to 1 million. That is unfathomable, to lose 22 to 1 million. And that is due primarily to disease, as well as some killing. Let's not forget the fact that these conquistadors, Columbus, Cortez, Pizarro, etc., also wage war on the indigenous peoples and murder many of them outright. But it is primarily due to disease. And that is going to have a major impact because when you lose that much of your population, that's like 90+%, right? Of your population that you lose within a few generations, that has major impacts on your quality of life, on your understanding of your culture, your understanding of your political structures. It completely devastates the region and is one of the reasons why the indigenous populations to this day in the 21st century are still struggling and are still some of our largest populations of dealing with poverty and insecurity. And it really, this is not a modern problem. This is something that goes back to the 16th century. So again, thinking about how history is relevant to our society today. And again, the systems of indigenous governments and society are completely destroyed by colonization and the colonizers. It's incredibly brutal. And this happens first in the Americas, but spoiler alert, it's going to happen a century later in Africa as well as Asia, which really speaks to, again, why we have this concept of the third world, these countries that are still struggling. It is largely due to this legacy of colonialism. It just happens first in the Americas. Speaking of Africa, at this time in 1750, they haven't really been colonized yet. I promise we're in the home stretch, y'all. We're getting there. Africa at this time, they're mostly independent, meaning that the region has not been colonized. And instead, there are large empires controlling many diverse tribal communities. Africa has thousands of tribal communities, small regional areas. I think there's more than 1,000 dialects spoken in the African continent, and probably more so at this time. But some of the major empires of the region in the west are going to be the Benin, which is a country now in Africa, the Oyo and the Asante, which will turn into Ghana, Congo, which turns into Democratic Republic of Congo, in Central Africa, and the Zulu in the south. I'm going to move forward so we can see this on a map here. So here we have our Benin, our Asante, our Oyos right here. This is what we're considering Western Africa, and then Central Africa, the Congo, and then Zimbabwe, Zulu. They're going to be in the south. And again, notice the slave trade regions, they're coming primarily from the west. So these are the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast areas. That's really where the slaves are primarily coming from. The enslaved peoples are primarily being stolen from. So these major empires, they control trade of raw materials and goods. If you remember, probably from 7th grade history, the salt trade and gold and all that, that's being controlled by these empires. And as I just said, the Western empires, Benin, Oyo, Asante, Hausa, etc. They're going to also gain a lot of wealth through slave trade. So what they do is they go out and they capture slaves. Slavery has always been part of these cultures, as it has been worldwide. And now what they do is they have their slaves and they sell them to the Spanish and the later British. And that's really what gives them a lot of wealth and that power. More about that later. And then the primary colonies that have colonies at this time and by 1750 are going to be Portugal and Spain. We're settling along the western coast. Remember, Portugal and Spain, they're our first seafarers. They're the first ones that really leave the region of Europe and first go around the Horn of Africa and first get to Asia and India, etc. So they're going to be the first ones that settle colonial settlements, but they're not really doing too much. It's not really until the later 19th century that Africa gets colonized. That's a story for another day. All right, so again, there's our map of what's going on with Africa. All right, so finally to wrap things up. So where we left in 1750, we have a lot of new trade and a lot of new empires being developed. And really, this is the period when Europe starts really to dominate around the world. And that's primarily due to the fact that they're the ones that are doing all the ship sailing, all this trade. They're the ones that are getting lots of wealth based off indigenous and slave labor from the Americas and later from Africa and Asia, at the expense of the colonies, at the expense of the land, at the expense of the people. As we see, they're getting all that raw material and using it to dominate and build and make a whole lot of money. And they're controlling all these trade routes, which is really leading to their wealth and their power. So just getting a sense of who's controlling what at this time. So here's Europe, and we can see just a little bit, Portugal's there, the Dutch are getting in there, a little bit more of the Portuguese. There's the Portuguese again, and the Dutch and the Spanish, and then the Spanish, the Dutch, and the British. So we can kind of see them starting to really expand upon themselves. And then we, of course, have our Russian, our Mughals, our Qing dynasty, Japan just chilling, doing their own thing over there, and the Ottomans starting to lose their land. By 1800, so within a century, we're going to see a lot of change. Notice there's a lot more expansion going around, but still maintaining a lot. The Ottoman Empire has gotten a little bit smaller. The Qing dynasty, the Mughal Empire is gone, but who's replaced them? The Marathas and the British. Notice the British are taking over a good chunk of India by the 19th century, and we're starting to see some more empires. And spoiler alert, this is going to turn totally from indigenous to 90+% controlled by Europe by 1885. Lest we think that everyone was just going along with it and super down to be colonized, there were many periods of revolts and rebellions, and I think that's important to note that we do have many rebellions. Unfortunately, they're majority unsuccessful in the Americas, as well as in Africa, as well as in Asia. That this is not just, people do not just sit down and suck it up and say, all right, we're colonized now. There is resistance. Why are they not successful? Because the Europeans have advanced artillery, they have weapons, and they're killing an awful lot of the indigenous peoples, especially in the Americas, through disease. So they have weapons and disease on their side, which is probably not the best things. When you want allies, and you want to be known by who you're hanging out with, I don't know if weapons and disease is really painting you the best picture, but that says something about what's going on globally and with Europe at that time. Penultimately, which if you don't remember, that's my favorite word. It means second to last. Just a little bit about population, which again speaks to who is dominating the globe at this time. Populations increased by 2.5%. So they just jump up between 1400 and 1800. This is due to better improved nutrition. But this is happening primarily in Asia and Europe. We can see here China is just going off like gangbusters, and they're going to continue that. India is growing a lot. Europe is growing a lot. And if we notice sub-Saharan Africa, they're reducing. That's due to slavery, that their population is so impacted. Remember those 12.5 million, but those are the slaves that made it across. So there's millions more that lose their life due to this production of slavery. And the Americas just really, really loses it due to disease and those population losses. So finally, that should be C right there. Forgot about that, so change that to a C. That people and governments are more connected than ever, and that's due to improved technology. That ships are faster and able to go farther, better sea routes, which means there's more migration, more movement. We see Europeans obviously starting to migrate and live in Europe and Asia and Africa. We also see Africans, Asians, Americans living in Europe and living amongst themselves. And that's only going to continue to the point where we live now, where people are moving all over the place. In addition, ideas and information are spread more easily. Religion is being spread. So as we said, the Christian missionaries spreading Catholicism in the Americas. The Ottomans are going to spread Islam throughout Eastern Europe and the Middle East, which is why the Middle East is still one of the largest areas of Islam to this day. And knowledge is increasing due to technological and social advancements. So things like the printing press is able to print paper and words, and the Bible is printed for the first time so people can read it for themselves. It's actually printed in Germanic. That's Martin Luther's whole thing, if you remember. We also see universities being developed at this time. And this is happening in Europe, as we kind of always learn about, but it's also happening in Asia. And in fact, Korea had a printing press before Gutenberg. And we also see universities and places of learning growing throughout Europe and Asia. So to sum up, the world is way more connected, and who is dominating those connections? Europe. And that's really going to set up for the rest of this semester and for the rest of world history. So congratulations, you've survived this first lecture. I hope it was enjoyable to you, and I look forward to discussing this in greater detail with you in class soon. All right, have a great day. Bye-bye.